Alright, so in this video we're going to be building a pure CSS navigation dropdown. So it's much like you'd find in any other JavaScript solution, a little bit less powerful, but it works very well, very quick, and obviously doesn't depend on you writing JavaScript for this or including any libraries you might need to do this. So let's take a look at how this works. We've done some basic styling here, nothing fancy, but you can obviously change this. And we have the normal navigation items at the top. These two here will click to drop down, like so. You can dismiss them by clicking anywhere else on the page. And this one just goes through to a website. So you're free to be a little bit more flexible and have links that go through to other pages rather than drop down. And these are obviously just sub-navigation items, which you can click and go through to pages. So we're going to be doing this with Sass, so make sure you have Sass installed. Go ahead and visit the website to get instructions on that. And let's get going with writing the code. Okay, so we're starting out with a very basic document layout here. So if you don't have this already and you are starting from scratch, go ahead and write all this up. And all I'm doing here is I'm linking in a style sheet, which currently doesn't exist. This is going to be generated when we do a Sass watch on our main file inside of our styles directory. And we also have linked in a Google font from the Google Fonts API. So if you do just head over to Google Fonts, you can just grab anything. I'm going to be using Open Sans, so that's the one that I've included in just here. So we're going to start off with the markup, and we're going to look at the very basics of the markup. Then we'll start to create our SCSS files, and then we'll go ahead and implement the functionality and things like transitions a little bit later. So the first thing I want to start off with is a nav element. This is going to hold our entire top nav bar, and I'm going to give this a class of nav main. So inside of this, I'm just going to create a div with a class of logo. This can obviously be anything you want, your logo for your website, some text, whatever you want in here. We'll just position that towards the left as you saw a moment ago. So for each of the nav items, so the actual items that you can see and the nav content, we're going to include these within an unordered list. So we'll create an unordered list here. We'll create a list item for each item. And inside of this, we're going to have an anchor. So this is just going to be the link. So for any drop-down items, you're going to want to have a hash. And for the text, you're just going to want what you want to be displayed. And I'm going to give these a class just so I can easily target them as well. So I'm going to call these nav item. So let's duplicate these down. So we'll create 3 of these. We'll have the first 2 as drop-downs. So let's just put some different text in here. And the last one is going to actually go through to a website. So this is going to be a sort of static link, if you like. It's not going to have a drop down. And we'll be creating the nav content under here in just a minute when we get to that. So at the moment on the page, you can see that we just have the following. Nothing special at all. It just looks very plain, but we'll obviously fix that. Let's also, while we're here, just create a div with a class of content just to store some content. So we'll create, say, 4 paragraphs with just some lorem ipsum in. This can be anything you want, just so we've got something to work with on the page, just to make sure everything's looking nice. So what we now need to do is start structuring out our styles directory, including things like mix-ins, placeholders, variables, our main file that we want to watch and compile, as well as partials, so for things like containers and navigation. Sounds a little bit more complicated than it is, and we're going to apply a very basic structure to this, but you can obviously feel free to change it up. So under styles then, let's start by creating a new file. This is going to be our main SCSS file, so app.scss, and this is going to import everything we need, and we need to watch this file for any changes. So let's do that now. Make sure you are in the directory that you're currently working in, and make sure you have Sass installed. You can just run sass v, and that's going to give you the version number and name. So now we're going to use watch to watch a particular file. In this case, it's styles app.scss, and we want to put the result of that into CSS app.css. So remember, we're using a CSS extension, so it can obviously be read by our browser. So that's now watching. So we'll have an app.css file just in here created. As we add more to this and include things, that'll obviously compile in. So we want to start then by defining some variables and things like that. So I'm just going to create these in this root directory, this styles directory. So for variables, we'll just say variables.scss, and we'll start to define some very basic variables. You can obviously change these up depending on what you need. So we're going to say font family. This is going to be Open Sans, and that's going to be a sans serif fallback. And we'll define the font size for the body as well. And down here, we'll define our navigation specific styles. So in this case, we're going to have a background color for our nav. This can be 222, for example, and we'll have a nav foreground color as well. And we'll set that to white. And I'm also going to include here a nav hover color or an active color. That's just going to be what happens when a user hovers over, and also when the drop down is selected, we want the top menu to stay on that color. So this is all we're going to do for now. You can obviously feel free to add to this, but let's close this off and let's include it in our app.css or SCSS file. So all we need to do is import variables. We obviously don't need an extension here. So we'll now look at including our partials. So I'll include this before we do anything. Obviously this doesn't exist at the moment, partials all. But let's inside of our styles directory create a new file for our partials. So these are just going to be bits of our website. So the first one then is going to be our containers. And this is just going to be our content area. So containers.scss. And let's create another one specifically for our nav. This is where most of our code for this video is going to sit. So that's nav.css or scss. So we also need that all file, which basically just collects all of our partials and puts them into one file, just so it's a little bit easier to manage. So we'll call this all.scss, and we'll go ahead and import in containers, and we'll import in nav. So that's now going to import these two, and they'll both be included on this page. So at the moment then, we don't have any particular styles applied to this app.css file. We've not really done much here. So under containers, I'm going to include the font placement or the font application inside of here. You don't need to do this in containers. It's just for this purpose of this video, makes it a little bit easier. So we're going to set the margin on the body and HTML to 0, just so we don't have any gaps. And then we're going to set the font to our font size, and then we're going to choose our font family. So all that's done then is just applied them to the body and HTML, so we now have a nice font. So for the containers then, we're also going to implement the content, and we're going to say we want the padding to be about 30 pixels, just so that sits out a little bit. Okay, so we can close containers off now. We don't need that anymore. We're going to focus now on nav. So the nav then, we need to style up the nav main, which is the class we gave to that nav element. So we're going to say nav main, and we're going to set a width on this to 100%. So it's 100% of the page. We're going to choose the background color, which remember we have as a variable. It's nav background color. And we're going to set a fixed height. You can obviously play around with this. It doesn't need to be a fixed height, but it's just simple for this video. I'm also going to set a foreground color, which is going to be nav foreground color. Okay. Right. So within this, then we're going to style up our logo. So we're nesting now, and I'm going to float that logo element left. I'm going to give this a fixed height of 40 pixels. I'm going to give this some padding. So we're going to say 15 pixels on the top and bottom and 30 pixels on the left and the right. And we're going to slightly increase the font size. This is probably another good candidate for a variable, just in case you need to change this. And we're going to give this a line height of 40 pixels. And we're going to introduce a line height for each of our navigation items as well, just so these sit nicely in line. But for now, we have the following. So it's starting to look a little bit better. So let's inspect this unordered list, and obviously because this has padding and margin, it's not sitting quite as we want. So it's pulling this down a little bit. So what we want to do then is we want to target the unordered list directly within this nav main element. And we want to float this left first of all. And for each of the list items within this, we want to float them left too. So we need to obviously tidy up this unordered list because at the moment what's happening is we're still getting these bullet points here, we're still getting the padding, we're still getting the margin, and we need to get rid of these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a placeholder for any unordered lists that need to be plain. And by plain, I mean get rid of the margin, get rid of the padding, and change the list style type to none. That just gets rid of our bullet points. So we're going to create within our main styles directory a file called placeholders.scss. And inside of here, we can now define a placeholder. So a placeholder is like a class in a way, but it's not applied to any element. We obviously apply a class to an element using dot, but in this case with Sass, we can just create a placeholder and we can extend this within any of our elements. So I'm going to set a margin and a padding to 0. And as mentioned, I'm going to change the list style type to none. So now within our nav folder, let's just close some of these off because we don't need them, or nav file rather, we're basically going to just extend the placeholder that we've already created. So let's extend this, extend. And remember our placeholder is called plain list. So what that will do is it will apply them styles to this, and we can reuse this where we need to. And we are going to be reusing this within the nav content. So if I refresh now, we see an error because I haven't included this inside of app.scss. So let's include placeholders in there. And while we're at it, we are going to be using mixins. So why don't we just create a mixins SCSS file, and let's include that as well, just so we don't forget. So mixins. Now mixin we're going to use for our transitions. So there we go. We've got a nice sort of tidy unordered list for these items, but they obviously don't look great at the moment. So we need to go ahead and fix that up. So we're going to target down here, nav item, and the nav item is going to be a display of inline block, just so we can treat it like a block element. Remember, these are anchors, so we want them to sit in line, but we want to treat them like a block element, and therefore we can add things like padding. So we're going to add 15 pixels on the top and the bottom, the same as we did for the logo, so it sits nicely in the same place, and 20 pixels on the left and the right, just to give each of them items a little bit of spacing either side. We are going to give these a fixed height as well, much the same as we did for our logo. We're also going to give these the same line height. This would be another good candidate for a variable, just so you can control these from one place. You don't have to update it here and here. If you ever do get repetition, that probably means you should be using a variable. So for the color here, we are going to set this to the nav foreground color. And we're also going to get rid of any text decoration. So we're going to set text decoration to none. Okay, so now that we've done that, we need to work out what happens when we hover over them. As we refresh, we can see they look a lot nicer now. We want this nice hover effect when we hover over. So all we're going to do is we are going to use our pseudo selector here, hover. We're going to change the background color. Remember, we created a variable for that. That was nav hover color. And that's pretty much it. So now we get a nice hover effect. Cool. So we want to now focus on the actual content, the drop downs that we see when we click, just so we know we've got them styled up nicely, and we can then hide them and show them as we need, and then apply transitions. So we're going to do this first. So the nav content then we haven't created, so let's go ahead and define these now. So we're going to say nav content, that's just a div of the class of nav content. Now what we're also going to do is we're going to have a nav sub element. The reason we're doing this is we want some kind of padding within this nav content. But because we're going to be using transitions, we're going to be transitioning on the maximum height of the element. And the maximum height is going to be applied to the nav content. Now, if we have padding there, it's not going to allow us to say max height 0 in order to hide it. It's still going to show some. So we're including a separate element, which we're going to add padding to just to avoid this. And if that doesn't make too much sense, play around with it and you'll see what I mean. So inside of the nav sub, we're going to have more unordered list and list items. These are just going to contain anchors though, and they can go off to absolutely anywhere you want. So I'm just going to say about us. We'll just write some silly things in here. Do you really care what is here? Just so we get a little bit of a longer one. And of course you do. So for the other nav content area, we'll do something similar, but I'm just going to say this is text. So you can include anything in these sub navigations, images, whatever you want to do. So at the moment then, let's take a look at how this looks. Doesn't look great. So at the moment it's interfering with the content here. We have got that text just in here, but we can't see it because remember, we gave a foreground color of white to anything within our navigation area. And this isn't looking great either. We need to apply our placeholder to this, which will get rid of these default styles on our unordered list. So if we go back over to our nav.scss, we can now start to position and style up our nav content. So we're going to say position absolute. We're going to set the top to 70 pixels. Obviously this could vary. It depends on how you're styling this up. We are going to set the overflow to hidden. The reason we're going to do this is we're applying a max height eventually of something like 400 pixels. If anything goes over that, we might just want to hide it. This is completely optional. And we also want to set a background color here, which is going to be the same background color as our navigation. So we just use our nav background color variable. And we also want to change the color of this as well. In fact, we probably don't need to do that, so we'll leave that one out. So inside of nav content then, any anchor within here, we want to set the color to nav foreground color, just so we make sure that any anchors are white. And we're also going to set the text decoration to none as well. And then what we're going to do is we're going to apply a hover pseudo selector. So we just say hover text decoration underline. Fairly straightforward. So all we're doing then is we're just changing the appearance of the container here, and we've got white text here where we need it, we've got white anchors where we need them, and we have this hover effect. Again, from a style point of view, entirely up to you. So then, the actual nav sub, so this is this part here, we want to focus on styling this up, so we're going to say nav sub. And the padding of this is going to be 20 pixels. So that's going to give us a little bit more padding. Now let's just take a look quickly at the nav content. Remember I said we're going to use a max height property of something like 0 to get rid of this, which works. This particular drop down is no longer visible. But if we also had a padding on that element, you can see that it does come down still. There are other ways around this, but for now we'll just leave that as it is, just because it makes life a little bit more simple, just with a little bit of extra markup. So the unordered lists within our nav sub, we want to again make these plain. So we're going to extend our plain list. Very, very straightforward with Sass. That just makes them a little bit plain. And then we want to style up the anchors within this. This is purely just something small, but it just allows us to give a little bit of padding on the top and the bottom of each anchor, just to space them out a little bit. So that's all that's done. So now what we want to do is return back to nav content, and we want to give these a max height of 0, and that will effectively make them disappear. They're still there, but we can show them when we need to. But that's the question, how do we then show these when we click on an anchor? Surely this is something we'd have to do with JavaScript. We'd have some kind of click event. We'd maybe add a class to make these visible, or we'd use jQuery to say .show using the show method. But we're going to do this obviously with pure CSS. So what we need to do then is on the nav item, So we're going to scroll back up to where our nav item is defined. We want to apply the focus pseudo selector. And when we do focus on these, we want to change the background color. Now focus is a little bit misleading, and we'll see why in a minute. So focus, you'd think, well, focus is something when I focus on it, like a form element. But in this case, when we click an anchor, it does possess the pseudo selector. So when I click this now and move away, you can see that the background color remains as we've just set here. So that means that because we can persist on this particular state, we can also apply styles to anything along the same line as this anchor. So what we're going to be doing then is when this anchor is focused, we want to look along the same level of elements, which we can do with CSS, pick out a particular class and then apply styles to that. So within this focus pseudo selector, we can use a tilde, which basically means anything along the same level as this element. So remember that nav item sits here. The only other element within this element here is nav content. So we can just say nav content. This can apply to any element along this same level. So now that we've done that, then all we need to do is change the maximum height. The maximum height is currently, if we find it, 0. But now when that anchor is clicked, the nav content has a max height of 400 pixels. So when I click this now, you can see that this is shown effectively, or the max height has been increased enough that we can see it. So now when I click on these two, I can just switch between them, and obviously clicking anywhere else on the page will automatically blur, which is basically saying out of focus, that anchor, and then therefore they disappear. So let's go ahead and finish up by adding some transition effects on the nav content. So what I want to do then is create a mix-in for this, just in case we need to reuse this anywhere else, which is highly likely. So I'm going to create a mix-in just inside of my mix-ins file that we created a moment ago. And this is going to be called transition. And if you're not too sure, a mix-in is almost like a function which gives you the ability to use it wherever you need to, passing in arguments or properties and then using them to just output CSS. So in this case, when we transition on a particular property. We choose the amount of time we want the transition to be from the start to the end, and we also have a type of transition as well. So let's write CSS as we normally would, but just factoring in these different properties we've passed through. So we say property, which could be something like max height, width, whatever you want. We choose the time here, and then we choose the type. So I'm going to duplicate this down because at the time of recording, I need the WebKit vendor prefix, and I also need the Moz vendor prefix. So this is just different browsers implementing different implementations of transition. So this is useful to have because it means we don't have to keep writing these out. And WebKit is obviously for Chrome and Safari, Moz is for Firefox. And then we have our standard implementation here. So now that we've got this transition mix-in, we can include this. Remember, we are including this within our app.scss file. So we can go ahead and use this. So all we need to do is include it, so transition, and then we choose the properties as normal. So max height is what we want to transition on. Remember, that's going from 0 to 400. We choose the time. In this case, I'm doing 0.4 seconds, but you could do something like 400 milliseconds or any other time you want this to take. And then we have the type. So we can do things like linear. We can do ease in, out, but I'm going to choose ease in. It's quite nice for this kind of effect. So now that we've got that done, as well as the actual ability to show an item, we now have these nicely transitioned down. We can dismiss them and do whatever else we need to do, as well as have this static link here which just goes off somewhere. So there we are. We've built a pure CSS drop-down navigation, no JavaScript needed at all.